Thank you, Bill. We're just going to plunge straight into some questions. We've got about half an hour.
I'm going to give this my best shot. In your talk, you referred to, I think, to Herzog's documentary of the Iraq War and the smoke and the Wagner playing in the soundtrack. In terms of your experience as an artist and what you've been through in the last couple of years and the world that we have, is there not perfection and art in what's actually happened around that whole experience in the last 2 years? And therefore, is there not art actually embodied in the whole outcome and how it's gone?
Well, look, perhaps you should stay there for a minute because I'm not entirely sure how to answer that question. There are certain things you have to be very careful of. And in those situations, one of them is not hardening up, because that will work against your art. Not developing a tough exterior or a tough skin. You have to remain soft. You have to remain sensitive to the beauty of the world around you, because if you let yourself toughen up in response to those situations, then your work will probably suffer. But I'm still thinking about how I can answer that question.
I think what you're saying too is you have to be active rather than reactive. If you allow what you do to be determined by the most negative aspects of the experience, then it necessarily begins to undermine what you're trying to do as an artist.
I think that an experience like that too, if one had doubts, not so much doubts aesthetically, I mean, all artists, if they're any good, I think are full of doubts all the time, you know. I spend most of my time sitting in a chair saying to myself, I don't buy it, looking at my work, you know. But I think if one was caused to seriously doubt or to consider that one may well have harmed people, I think that might shake your conviction and perhaps cause you to, you know, derail yourself a little bit. But that's not something that has been my experience. And it seems from all of the people that I've been in contact with going back 35 years, the universal response has been one of support in terms of my models. So I've never really had those misgivings. I mean, what's the worst that can be said about it? I suppose that there may well have been an error of judgment at some point, not in relation to anyone that I know or am aware of, but I suppose in 35 years of professional work, it'd be very hard to find anyone in any profession who hasn't perhaps made an error of judgment at some point. But in terms of the models themselves, I'm not aware of it. So I feel that my core or my central kind of gyroscope was never really off balance or unbalanced by that experience.
Do we have another question?
How much do you hope this lecture would change? How many people would listen to what you have to say, apart from people who had gathered here and people who would listen to this lecture later?
Do I hope to change something by giving a lecture? Or?
Not change the world, but change something, maybe something little.
Well, I think in a way we have to kind of always, be true to ourselves. In a way, those rather eccentric associations which you were listening to before were there because that's the reality of my interior life. I think where art's concerned, there's a golden rule. It has two parts, like araldite. You need A and B, like an epoxy resin. Part one is be true to yourself, always. Part two is don't stop working. And I suppose if there's anything at all useful in being here, it might just be, by example, saying that you must continue to be true to yourself, you must continue to do your work. And if that's of some benefit to people, then I'm very pleased about that.
So now, next question over here.
Yes. Do you believe that the attitude towards the nude has changed in Australia irrevocably since the incident 2 years ago?
Oh, I don't think that it's changed irrevocably. I think that there has been quite an attempt to, as I said before, conflate this kind of artificial situation where, because of, I suppose, a rise of fundamentalism, which we see, around the world, all kinds of fundamentalism, country and Western, you get this kind of reduction of things to black and white, which is why my speech had that title, With Us or Against Us. You're either with us or against it, black and white. Where's the grey gone? And so, in a situation like this, it's predictable, I imagine, to see that, people are divided into sort of opposing camps and then start throwing beer bottles at each other. But I think beneath the kind of, the veneer of what the media do and so forth, and I have, no real problem with the media. The media are a value-neutral opportunist. They're there to make money. We sometimes forget, when all the news and current affairs and issues flying back and forth, that it's a business. Its primary reason for existence is to make money, and if they weren't making money, they wouldn't exist. But that beneath all of that, most people do understand that 90% of life is grey. And where, the human body is concerned and the history of the nude in art is concerned, that this, is not something that's just going to change suddenly. I think when we have these mad spikes, which will continue, I'm sure, the vast majority of people you don't hear from. You hear from the vigilante group. You hear from, of course, you hear it in the media because the media love a fight. It doesn't really matter who's fighting who, what they're fighting about. It's about selling advertising. So that part of it's kind of a given. But I believe that there's still the vast majority of people have a kind of grassroots common sense, which in a way insulates them against this stuff. So I don't feel too worried about it. It may well be inconvenient and crazy from time to time, but everything we know about the world comes to us through our bodies. The idea of banning the human body at whatever age as a subject for art is, it is ridiculous if you look at it in historical context. So I think it's probably a passing thing. Everything's a wave, as they say,
100 years ago, of course, we were all scandalised by Norman Lindsay's nudes. These pneumatic, pouting, salacious ladies and with their leering pirates. So it's rather strange that 1 century later we've totally reversed our sources of anxiety vis-a-vis the nude. Now we could have as many pouting, pneumatic, salacious nudes as we like in popular culture, but we're terribly concerned about the adolescent. I don't know what that says about us, and I better not get Bill started on that. Another question?
I just wanted to ask, I hope I don't come across as forward, but you mentioned a lot of kind of canonistic kind of literature, art, whatever. Why is it that you don't mention kind of contemporary art as important for sharing with young people?
I think I made a couple of fairly strongly emphasised points about ongoing support for the arts and about the active support of things that may come into existence in the future. But my point in sort of concentrating on older art, if you like, and musical references is, it was to say, firstly, these are the things that have made a lasting impression on me. And Twombly's still alive. He's pretty old, but he's alive. And you've got to take those things as the bedrock. I think I used the term bedrock. You've got to say, how significant is the importance of art in the history of culture, in the history of civilization? And so, I suppose my eccentric path was a way of saying, look, it is at the centre of everything to do with our culture. Everything we think of and we know about Edwardian England or Elizabethan England or, Renaissance Italy, all of the ways in which we approach the past cultures we do through art. And so it was a way of saying, is it no longer important? Have we suddenly become like some creature from another planet, that art isn't, at the centre of the debate, that it isn't taken seriously by the politicians? And I suppose that's why I was, in a way, backward-looking with that to some extent. In a way, you have to kind of look at the past if you want to figure out what you think about the present and the future.
Next question.
I feel like for a lot of artists, their practice is driven by some fundamental event or idea that they just keep coming back to and addressing in their work. I was wondering for you whether you have a single or a number of ideas or events or moments from which your art begins and that you can't help coming back and continually addressing in your work.
I think not so much about one or a handful of particular events. I feel incredibly fortunate because, you know, for better or worse, I get up in the morning and it's incredible all day. And it's not necessarily incredible because I'm looking at a picture of my own in the studio. It's incredible because of the light. It's incredible because of the weather. How was that storm last night? It's incredible because of the life around you, the beauty of life, as I said before. I'm drunk on it the whole time. And so really for me it's more about allowing this editing process, which is not just a cultural thing, it's a thing to do with the entire sort of feeling we have of being inside nature. And so there's not really a particular thing. You know, I become obsessed with certain visual arts, certain pieces of music, certain things. And of course, you know, they stimulate us in certain ways, but for me it's incredible all the time, so I find it very hard to sort of pick particular things out. I might listen to one piece of music alone for 6 months. The slow movement of Mozart's 11th piano concerto for 6 months, over and over and over. In fact, that was the single piece of music I think I listened to almost without exception in the 6 months leading up to that show in 2008 that was shut down in Sydney. So, you know, your centre of gravity is constantly shifting and being influenced by everything, you know, cultural influences, but then the rest of nature as well. So for me, it's very broad.
My question was, you mentioned that you had overwhelming support from models for over 35 years. Do you mean that after that controversy people came forward to you and volunteered their support, or how did that happen? The other question I wanted to ask was about sourcing models since then, whether parents have been affected by the controversy and whether invitations to schools have been as forthcoming as previously.
Well, to answer the first question, I'm still friends with people I photographed 35 years ago. I'm still friends with people that I photographed at the age of 12 who ring me up to complain about their adult children misbehaving. You know, you don't stay in contact with everyone over that period. Some people move to the other side of the world. Some people die. But I still regard myself as being fortunate because the people that I am in contact with are all supportive. I mean, I spent quite a lot of time convincing them not to come forward and sort of weigh into the debate because, of course, you know, all that was going to do was get chopped up and used in the press for whatever. Obviously, the press did track down a few people, and they were pretty strong in their support. I remember one model of mine who's appears in Lux et Nox, that book from 2002. She opened the door of her house in Thornbury and there was the press, I can't remember which newspaper. And her mother came to the door and gave them a piece of her mind. And the girl rang me up and sort of said, I tried to get a word in, but I just couldn't say anything. Mum just kind of tore strips off them, you know, and that was the end of that. But that story was repeated quite a bit. You know, I'm prepared to accept that perhaps out there somewhere, at whatever point in the past, there could be someone who looks back on their involvement with me as a model and thinks to themselves, always felt a bit weird, I wish I hadn't done that. You know, the most you can really say about it, though, is that it was an error of judgment. You have to live, you know. What about all those kids that study ballet? You know, they sacrifice a huge part of their lives all through their childhood, and then at the age of puberty, suddenly nature decides she's got other plans for them. Do you regret having spent all that time standing at the bar and sweating blood? Do you regret the fact that you were riding a horse and fell off and, you know, injured yourself? And this whole thing about living in a state of regret is a kind of sickness, I think. It's something that we should try to avoid. So, from my point of view, I feel tremendously fortunate, and it's always a big deal when someone agrees to model for me. And usually when you do model, when you do work with someone, they work with you for years, not just once or twice. And so they become friends, and they grow up and they go to uni and they buy a car and they have kids, and on it goes. The second part of the question relating to the availability of models, I think really, well, I have been speaking at schools. I haven't stopped speaking at schools. But of course, having spoken at hundreds of schools over decades, I know a lot of the teachers. I know I've spoken to the, Victorian Art Teachers Association at their invitation many times. And in fact, I've always seen it as a way of putting back, always at the school's request and never at any cost to the school. I must have done 1,000 of them in the last 20 or 30 years. And they keep coming, but schools are concerned, of course, about the publicity. They're not concerned about, you can pick up from art teachers that you speak to and they say, it's driving us crazy. The kids are missing out. We want to have you back. Principal's worried about the publicity, So there is a kind of a sense in which people are worried about being caught up in some crazy media sort of blitz again. But it hasn't really had much of an effect on the actual work I'm doing and the people that I'm working with, not recently.
We have another question over here.
Throughout your lecture, you mentioned a lot of creative medias, from film and music and those other sort of creative medias. You didn't really, I might have missed it, but address photography. So I was wondering, why do you specifically choose the medium of photography, and what do you think is the viewer's reaction to a photograph as opposed to like a painting and all those other mediums that you mentioned?
Look, I think in the end, it doesn't matter which medium it is, it's what you do with it. No medium, it's absurd to think that any medium is more or less limited than any other. It's what a person does with it, And for me, it just seems that perhaps photography falls less short, perhaps.
Remember that Cartier-Bresson used to tell interviewers constantly that he wasn't interested in photography.
Oh, yes. I didn't know that. I agree. Yeah. Well, no, there are photographers that whose work I think is spellbinding. Go and have a look at O. Winston Link, American guy from the 50s who photographed trains at night, heavy industrial landscapes, but they feel more like dreamscapes. They're really beautiful. So there are photographers certainly that I'm interested in. My friend Monica Faber, who's head of the photography department at the Albertina in Vienna. The Albertina has the greatest collection of works on paper in Europe. Monica just completed a book on Heinrich Kuhn, secessionist photographer, turn of the 19th into 20th century. All of these really early colour photographs, autochrome process, they're really haunting. And there's a lot of photography that I'm interested in looking at. But the problem is that, photography is just this. There's also painting, sculpture, music, literature. So, there's only so much that I'm prepared to bore you with, and that's what I chose to bore you with tonight.
I think it's almost taken for granted that all the great photographers never want to discuss photography per se. They like to discuss the image, they like to discuss the subject. Yeah. It's the actual thing that they're photographing which is exciting to them, not the medium or the genre itself.
And in fact, John, I think that when something really works, it's as though the technique and the materials disappear into the overall experience of the work. I mean, it reminds me of that great thing that Mark Rothko, the American abstract expressionist, said to Dory Ashton. Dory Ashton was a great art critic for the New York Times. He said, when it's really working, it's not a painting.
And he also said that he wasn't an abstract artist.
Yes.
So behind you can say anything, really.
Yeah, it's like Samuel Goldwyn, include me out.
Okay, next question.
Do you feel the fear of censorship is having a dramatic influence on the progression of contemporary art? And I'm talking also about self-censorship in the art world.
Well, the reason that I made those kind of comments about, the political dimension, at least, of some of those comments was because I believe, as I said before, that there is a great pool of common sense and reasonableness, but sometimes that gets hijacked by vigilantism. And, there's a disproportionate amount of airplay given to the people that scream loudest, of course, where the vast majority of people go about their business thinking, what's that about? So I think that putting aside the official business of the Classifications Board and ACMA and all of the kind of instrumentalities that operate independently of politics, the problem is, what I was referring to, I think, in my talk, is that you hope that there's not a failure of nerve at the top. The problem for art is if it ends up becoming the punching bag, then we're in trouble. It's really to do with a failure of nerve. It's to do with the difference between this political expediency, the ease with which you can have a free kick or land a punch, and statesmanship. Statesmanship is what I think I mentioned as the thing that we need to see more of in relation to art. I sometimes think of Churchill again, for example. When the British were losing badly before the Americans had come into the Second World War, Churchill got up on the radio and said to the British people, "I've got good news. Hitler will lose the war." That's statesmanship. It's sort of like the opposite to rabble-rousing. And this is sort of what I was getting at a little bit. I think we all know that. So I would like to think that we don't need to fear this kind of, stupidity is going to get too far out of hand. As I said before, people, they do get confused. They're not sure. What do we think about notions of consent and harm and things like that? It all gets mixed up. It all gets conflated into this kind of brew that then is sort of, pure tabloid.
I think that, I really can't let you go without drawing that out a little bit more.
Well, let's do it.
Because the issue which has been mooted about so many of these moments in the 2008 controversy is all about artistic freedom. Now, in a sense, it's artistic freedom that's been vilified by this. It's been that sense that artists are going too far, that they believe they can do anything they like, that they overrule the law, that they make their own rules, they have their own ethical code. Well, that's not true. We have the law of the land, which up until this point has been perfectly competent at prosecuting things which actually transgress those laws which are in the books and statutes. However, in recent years, partly as a result of these particular events, we've had a series of laws put onto the books which are, to all intents and purposes, almost dysfunctional. Laws that if you tried to enforce them to the letter and in every possible instance would occupy the police like 100 times more than they could ever possibly conceive of doing. So why is it that we actually have these laws on the books which are almost unenforceable, and what can we do about them?
See, I think one of the problems is that it's...
Sorry, Bill, can you just actually explain the nature of them in New South Wales and Victoria a little bit?
Okay, well, earlier this year, I think it was, the Attorney-General of New South Wales was very publicly out there promoting the fact that they'd closed a loophole by removing a degree of ambiguity, perhaps I accept that, in New South Wales law relating to pornography, children, child welfare and so forth. But the general thrust of what he had to say was that he was closing a loophole, with the implication, I suppose, there that this was going to prevent, the exploitation of the law. The particular thing that was changed, though, was a law that in the history of New South Wales had never, ever been successfully used. The excuse that something was art rather than child pornography. It had never been used in the history of New South Wales once, effectively or successfully. It had only been tried once and immediately thrown out because it was obvious to everyone, I imagine, in that case, that they were dealing with child pornography. But there was this big public song and dance made about the loophole being closed. And there was a very good editorial in the SMH about it, actually, saying, you know, this is really more a bashing art in a way. It's such an easy free kick. So, you know, my position is that we need to kind of expect our politicians to rise to the occasion and be a little bit more statesmanlike about this. You know, that's probably where I'm coming from, I suppose. A couple of important things I probably should say, because we're probably getting toward the end of it, but people who are otherwise quite clear and, you know, sharp in their opinions do get confused when notions of consent and harm come up. I mentioned it in passing there in my speech. But, you know, and I probably have to thank a few of my barrister mates for straightening these facts out for me. Kids do consent to all kinds of significant things all the time in this state and in this country. You know, a baby cannot consent to an injection, but the parents consent on the baby's behalf. A 10-year-old can consent to something that might otherwise be unlawful assault, dental work. In this state, a 15-year-old can consent to a sex change. These are pretty serious things. Children's consent plays a major part in divorce proceedings all the time. Children's consent, where serious medical procedures are concerned, are taken into account all the time. There is a mountain of case law in this state that shows that consent is something that gradually increases as kids move toward their majority. This is the reality of the law today. So when people say, oh, children can't consent to something like that, it's sheer nonsense. Now, of course, you can't speak about consent without speaking about harm. Now, I'm not talking about imagined harm, notional harm, perceived harm. Actual harm to actual kids. I'd suggest that every day in this state and around the country, children consent, and their children consent, and schools, both government and private, consent to activities that result in real harm to real kids all the time. Significant amounts of harm which are accurately documented and there for any of us who care to look them up. I'm talking about the harm that results from underage contact sport. Imagine being a happy, healthy 12-year-old boy kicking a football around 1 minute and then finding yourself in a wheelchair for the rest of your life. We can't imagine the psychological and emotional damage. But these things happen every day. There is a significant amount of harm that is done to children as a result of children and their parents and various authorities consenting to certain activities. You know, it's all very well, you know, two wrongs don't make a right, I hear from the back of the hall, and I agree. But where there is massive statistical information to show the real harm to real kids that results from that, spinal injuries resulting from girls in pony clubs, it's significant. There's no specific documentation to suggest anywhere, so far as my legal researchers have been able to discover, that shows that life modelling by children for artists results in physical or psychological damage. So here we have this thing, significant amounts of harm that we allow to happen. You know, it comes back to a matter of the bigger picture when you look at this thing.
Well, I think I better clarify here that Bill Henson is not trying to undermine AFL or anything like that, because it's already had enough controversy in 2008, and we don't want to impinge upon another religious controversy today.
No. Can you imagine getting up on a ticket, if you're a politician, on the the ticket of banning all underage sport? It's ridiculous.
Well, we've just seen Julia Gillard, you know, with arm in arm with Barry Hall, spread across the newspapers. Now, we're actually a little bit over time now. I think if somebody had a small burning question, we could probably squeeze it in.
One more?
One for the road? Okay, fire away.
You spoke earlier about how art is truth, or that art is a truth. Why do you think it is that people find that truth so uncomfortable, or that some people find that truth so uncomfortable?
Well, I think that was sort of fairly evident in the talk I just gave before. You know, it's because it's a wild thing to tame. You know, it's not something that can be sort of nailed down and kept in one spot. You know, it's something. The truth of one person's life is different from the truth of another person's life, and so you have to find your own way to it. And I think it's disconcerting when we all spend our lives, as I said, you know, going at a green light and stopping at a red light.
Okay, thank you very much, Bill. Thank you for spending so much time.
Thanks, John. Thank you.